Just before we get started today, I do want to say that we're recording this on Monday, the 31st of July. Since Ukraine is currently undertaking a major push south, that means important events might have happened between our recording of this and you seeing it. Rest assured, we'll update you on any breakthroughs as soon as we can. But for now, here is our analysis of how Ukraine's counteroffensive stood as of Monday afternoon, about 10 to 4. Enjoy. So it was the moment the world we were waiting half a year for. The spring gave way to summer, and Russia's early 2023 offensive sputtered out after taking Bakhmut. Western media eagerly turned their attention to Kiev. For months, anticipation had been building. That the coming Ukrainian counteroffensive would quickly shatter Russian lines. That, armed with Western equipment and trained to NATO standards, Kiev's forces would fast march all the way to Crimea. Sure, the going was going to be tough, a journey through hell, no doubt, but there was confidence in it too. Confidence that Moscow's military might soon be dealt a killer blow. Fast forward to today, though, and we still seem to be waiting for that blow to fall. Instead of weeks, Western countries are now waiting with bated breath for 2 months. Ukraine's progress has been measured not in kilometers, but in meters. 2 months in which bodies have piled high, even as momentum seems to have all but faded. So is this a sign that we're still in the warm-up stage, or does it point to a deeper problem within Ukraine's military? Perhaps even a sign that the long-awaited counteroffensive has actually failed? Well, in today's video, we're going to take stock of the first 2 months of Ukraine's summer 2023 fightback and try and figure out what has happened so far and where things go from here. So for those trying to put a positive spin on things, there's been a lot to celebrate about Ukraine's summer counteroffensive. Since launching in early June of 2023, the operation has liberated over 300 square kilometers. As Britain's Defense Secretary Ben Wallace has noted, quote, "That's more territory than Russia seized in its whole winter offensive." Compared to where Ukraine was at its lowest point in the war, things are looking even brighter. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken recently highlighted how Kiev has recaptured more than half of all territory that Russia has seized since the beginning of its full-scale invasion, most notably in spectacular operations around Kharkiv and Kherson in the fall of 2022. Since last Thursday too, a major push south has seen new villages liberated on the road to Mariupol as the armed forces of Ukraine, or AFU, at last advance beyond Russia's defensive lines. However, while all of this is true, it's still short of where many Western pundits and analysts hoped things would be by now. Many Ukrainians too. In remarks to reporters, President Volodymyr Zelensky recently admitted that things were going, quote, slower than desired, while also pointing out that it wasn't a Hollywood movie. Or as military intelligence specialist Konrad Muzyka told CNBC, "I think the Ukrainians expected the counteroffensive to gather sufficient momentum to allow them to continue to push south at a much faster rate. Unfortunately, it didn't happen." Exactly why that was the case is something that we're going to be analysing in the coming chapters. But first, we do need to take a quick overview of the state of play, of how things are going on the ground. Because it's only once we get our heads around where things stand after 2 months that we can truly appreciate the challenges that lie ahead. And the first thing to note is that when it started in early June, the counteroffensive was marked by a string of quick victories. Over a week or so, Ukraine was able to push forwards in the south, liberating a handful of villages. In the east, the AFU regains the initiative at the Battle of Bakhmut, pushing Russian defenders into a precarious position. Equally important to note, though, is that these small victories were accomplished by crushing losses. By some estimates, 20% of Kiev's Western-supplied vehicles were knocked out in that first week, including high-value kit like Leopards and Bradleys. In some cases, these losses were truly spectacular. Responsible Statecraft magazine has covered an attack that took place on June the 5th in Zaporizhia, featuring the NATO-trained 47th and 33rd Mechanized Brigades. Driving straight at Russian defensive lines, the 2 brigades wound up getting funneled into a minefield and destroyed. You may have seen photos of that catastrophe doing the rounds on social media. It's an unfortunate visual metaphor for how the AFU has spent the past 2 months stuck and unable to advance. In many sectors, that sadly remains the case. According to independent Russian outlet Meduza, most of Ukraine's attacking forces remain in a 6-kilometer zone dubbed no man's land, unable to reach even the first line of Russia's fortifications. The major exception to this is the southern theater in the western Zaporizhia Oblast, where a sustained assault since last Thursday has finally crossed Russia's first defensive lines. In the east, The other exception is around the ruined town of Bakhmut. There, steady Ukrainian advances and weaker Russian defenses point to a potential future breakthrough. Broadly, though, the picture's somewhat disappointing. A snapshot of a world in which both sides suffer massive casualties while Ukraine ekes out gains that are measured in meters. Now, for those of us who cheered on the AFU as it liberated first Kharkiv and then Kherson in the fall of 2022, this can be pretty tough to see. Doubtless, many of us were hoping for a replay of those euphoric months. Unfortunately, though, both those victories were born of circumstances that are unlikely to be repeated. In Kharkiv's case, when Ukraine swiftly retook 12,000 square kilometers, the key element was surprise. With Russia focused on holding Kherson, no one in the Kremlin noticed their undermanned lines outside Ukraine's second city. Undermanned lines that the AFU quickly took advantage of. In Kherson, things were even simpler. Russian forces were trying to hold a pocket on the west bank of the Dnieper, while Ukraine constantly bombarded their limited resupply lines with HIMARS. Retreat was the only sensible option. With the current counteroffensive, though, none of that applies. Russian troops are well dug in, they're well prepared, and they lack any overt geographic disadvantages. Hence a recent flood of takes suggesting things have more or less reached a stalemate. Foreign Affairs recently called it an unwinnable war. In the Telegraph, Colonel Richard Kemp wrote, "Ukraine's counteroffensive is failing with no easy fixes." For all chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley might like to remind people that the operation is, quote, far from a failure. It's hard to shake the feeling that, so far, it's also far from a success. Our task today, then, is to try and examine this first phase of Ukraine's counteroffensive and figure out why. Why has it disappointed so many observers? What has caused progress so far to be so slow? For that, we need to begin by examining the toughest obstacle of all, Russia's formidable defenses. Sergei Surovikin is not exactly what you'd call a nice guy. Nicknamed General Armageddon for his role in the brutal air campaign in Syria, the commander is also a guy with deep ties to the bloodthirsty Wagner group, ties that have seen him all but vanish following the recent mutiny. What Surovikin is, though, is a competent military man. In a war typified by displays of Russian incompetence, Surovikin may be the only one of Putin's generals able to do his job well. It was Surovikin, for example, who oversaw the orderly withdrawal from Kherson. Surovikin, who blunted Ukraine's post-Kharkiv rampage through Russian lines, ensuring more territory wasn't liberated. But his greatest contribution to the war may have been the Surovikin Line. Designed to stop Ukraine's forces making any further gains in late 2022, the Surovikin Line eventually grew into what the Center for Strategic and International Studies has called, quote, one of the largest defensive systems in Europe since World War II. While their masterminds may have vanished post-mutiny, his defenses haven't, and they are a key reason Ukraine has yet to make a major breakthrough. Stretching 2,000 kilometers from Ukraine's northern border with Russia all the way down in a crescent through the occupied territories and on to the Dnipro Delta, these lines are up to 30 kilometers deep. That means 30 kilometers of minefields, trenches, anti-tank obstacles like dragon's teeth, razor wire, booby traps, and earthen berms, all designed to turn an attacking force into target practice. On his Substack, former Australian Major General Mick Ryan broke down the logic behind these defenses, saying, generally, obstacles can be used to turn an enemy force into an engagement area, disrupt their formations by breaking up mounted and dismounted forces to fix an enemy force in certain territory to engage them or block them so they can be engaged and destroyed by reaching designated objectives. Basically, the lines are like a spectacularly difficult assault course, one in which geography and obstacles are designed to funnel you right into a kill zone where you can be picked off at your enemy's leisure. That this is a nightmare to overcome should be no news to anybody. Drives The Warzone spoke to analyst Franz-Stefan Gady, who pointed out that, quote, even the United States armed forces would have a difficult time breaking through these defensive layers because no Western military in the world currently has any experience in breaching the types of defenses in depth that the Russians put up. Despite their heroism, despite their bravery and formidable performance so far, the AFU are not equal to the United States Army. This then is a major reason why advances have been so painfully slow these last 2 months. The Surovikin Line is simply doing what it was designed to do. Nowhere has this been more visible than in the troubles Ukraine's forces have had clearing minefields. Back in 1943, the USSR laid over 1 million mines to stymie the Nazis before the Battle of Kursk. Since then, mass use of mines has been a basic part of Russian defensive doctrine. In the south, the AFU is currently being forced across extremely dense minefields littered with many different types of explosives. Not only are there regular landmines, there are also jumping mines which leap up and spray shrapnel, as well as tiny plastic butterfly mines that are almost impossible to detect. Many of the mines are themselves booby-trapped to stop anyone defusing them, and if that wasn't enough, Russian forces also routinely refresh the fields, firing cluster munitions that spray butterfly mines far and wide. Now, for a military with US levels of funding and equipment, this might not be a fatal problem. A mass combination of tanks and mine-clearing vehicles would be enough to carve a path. But Ukraine simply doesn't have the equipment. Promised Western mine clearers weren't delivered, and those that were are now priority number one for Russian artillery. As a result, progress through these fields has to be made on foot. Experts creep ahead, gingerly determine a narrow path, and infantry follow. It's slow. It's painful progress. By most counts, mines have now overtaken artillery as the leading cause of death and injury for Ukraine's forces. Darkly impressive as they are, though, the Surovikin lines would all be for naught if Russia's troops were incapable of defending them. And it's here that we come to the next unwelcome surprise of Ukraine's counteroffensive. Russian forces have thus far acted more competently than anybody really expected. So right up to the moment that Putin launched his full-scale invasion, the whole world seemed to have bought into his propaganda that the Russian military was an unstoppable machine, a force that would roll over Ukraine like a tsunami. Then the war actually began, and it became clear that the Kremlin's army was really a Potemkin force. A cracked and broken Matryoshka doll with nothing on the inside. Since then, well-publicized setbacks have completely flipped the narrative. Now the Russian army in Western media more readily resembles the one in Ukrainian propaganda, a collection of drunken klutzers too busy stealing raccoons to do any fighting, one in which the only competent soldiers are those from the Wagner Group. But just as it was foolish for us to drink Putin's military Kool-Aid, so might it be totally wrong-headed to believe only stories of alcoholism and low morale. Because if one thing has so far really stood out from Ukraine's counteroffensive, it's that Moscow's forces are putting up a surprisingly competent fight. Analyst Franz Stefan Gady had a good thread about this on Twitter, actually, following a visit that he and other experts have made to the front lines. He stated, "Quality of Russian forces varies. Attrition is hitting them hard, but they are defending their positions well, according to the Ukrainians we spoke to. They have been quite adaptable at the tactical level and are broadly defending according to Soviet-Russian doctrine. In some places on the front, that's included stuff like improved artillery, targeting of trenches Ukraine conquers, meaning the AFU can't hold new positions very long. In others, it involves more complex stuff like electronic warfare. According to the New York Times, quote, Russian abilities outmatch those of the Ukrainians. Russian forces can detect cell phone signals and jam GPS and radio frequencies, and they're often looking for Starlink Wi-Fi routers to target with their artillery." Now, for those of us who remember how Moscow's forces kept getting killed by HIMARS in 2022 because they were talking on unsecured channels, this can be pretty unexpected, like watching a Roadrunner cartoon where Wile E. Coyote learns to stop running off the cliff or something. But that's kind of the point. A real-life war isn't just some cartoon where nothing ever changes. Rather than making the same mistakes over and over again, the Russian side has gradually learned. Habits have improved, countermeasures have been put in place. In other words, the Russian army of 2023 is not the same beast that the Russian army was in 2022. Today's forces have, according to Gady, good battlefield ISR, that's information surveillance reconnaissance coverage. And while they may be losing men to Ukrainian assaults, they have yet to call up all their operational reserves. And that last part's important, since it means the Kremlin has been free to redeploy some forces elsewhere along the line. Some of these forces have even made gains. Medusa recently recorded high-intensity combat all along the front, even in areas where Ukraine isn't attempting to advance, as Russian soldiers launch what are often large assaults. Analyst Rob Lee tweeted last week that Russian forces have made gains southwest of Svatov in these attacks, although as of Monday it seems that Ukraine has regained these lost positions. It's worth noting here that the point of these assaults isn't to shatter Ukrainian lines and make sweeping gains. There are too few troops involved for that. No. The point is to force Kiev into making unpalatable choices, to make the AFU divert resources from their counteroffensive to shore up defenses. The fact that the Russians are able to do this at all shows just how well the Surovikin Line is absorbing Ukraine's assaults. Still, this isn't the same as saying Russia's forces are on the front foot. With Western intelligence suggesting the Kremlin lost so many men in the winter offensive that Russia will be unable to conduct major operations prior to 2024, the army is clearly damaged and in need of a good rest and refit. Russian telegram channels, too, remain visibly worried about Ukraine's ability to progress, in stark contrast with disappointed Western analysts. On the other hand, it's worth being honest about what's happening here. And the basic story is that Russian forces are defending well, according to doctrine, and with a tenacity that the Ukrainians just didn't expect. And that brings us to the next and slightly awkward thing to analyze. After 2 chapters of asking what Russian forces have done right, we now need to ask the opposite question. A question that's likely unwelcome, but really is necessary. What has Ukraine done wrong? So, if you've been following the events in Ukraine, you've probably come across the air power debate. Briefly, there's a lively discussion as to what role Kyiv's lack of air power plays in the slow pace of the counteroffensive. As airfew troops advance, they keep moving out of air defense range, at which point Russian attack helicopters descend and cause carnage. On one side of the debate are those who essentially blame Ukraine's Western partners for this. Had Kyiv received the F-16s it requested, Russia would not have its air power advantage and the counteroffensive could proceed quicker. On the other side are those who believe it isn't so simple, that the lack of F-16s doesn't help, but also isn't the only cause of Ukraine's problems. As analyst Michael Kaufman wrote on Twitter to quote, "Lack of air superiority isn't the only issue, and having Western aircraft does not equal attaining air superiority." If that's the case, then what's the issue? What has caused the AFU to go from an underdog beating expectations to one advancing in increments? For Franz Stefan Gady, the key seems to be the inability of Ukraine's forces to scale up operations to a sufficient level. Quote, "Ukrainian forces have still not mastered combined arms operations at scale. Operations are more sequential than synchronized. This creates various problems for the offense and, in my opinion, is the main cause for slow progress." What this basically means is that instead of perfectly coordinating all aspects of an assault, from the artillery barrage to the mechanized brigades to infantry advances, the AFU are trying to do them one after the other. For example, there was an incident early on in the counteroffensive, as recounted on a War in Iraq's podcast, in which Western tanks were supposed to advance in the early morning with artillery cover fire. For whatever reason, the advance got delayed until dawn, but the artillery still started on time, meaning the barrage had finished about 2 hours before the tanks even began moving. Combined arms operations at scale are hard for even military superpowers to pull off, so this is in no way intended to diminish or belittle Ukraine's defenders. What it is intended to do, though, is to be a bit of a wake-up call, a shot of sobriety for those still dreaming of a fast and of a painless Ukrainian victory. Until the AFU can figure out how to gel as a whole, things are not going to improve. Here's Rob Lee. "I wouldn't say Ukraine can't conduct combined arms operations, but I think it struggles to do so at higher levels, for example, brigade level. We often see brigades fighting their own fight. This core issue means it almost doesn't matter how many advanced weapons that the West ships to Kyiv." Here's Franz Stefan Gady again. "An additional influx of weapon systems will likely not have a decisive tactical impact without adaptation and more effective integration." Now, the good news is that analysts report seeing these necessary changes already taking place, but it is a slow process, especially given the current makeup of the AFU. Frontline soldiers on social media have been pretty openly complaining about the return of Soviet-style thinking to the military, a sharp contrast to the flexibility of Ukraine's forces in the war's early months. So, what's happened here? And the basic answer is the same thing that's happened to the Russian army. With casualty rates so high, the two militaries are today made up of wholly different components than they were this time last year. Sort of like a real-life version of Theseus's ship or Trigger's broom. That means many of those who led the initial defense are no longer around, especially after Kyiv prioritized using experienced units to hold the line in places like Bakhmut over winter. In many cases, those fighting the counteroffensive are newish recruits with only a few months NATO training under their belts. As a result, they make mistakes that more seasoned soldiers just might not. Per analyst John Helen, equipment is only as good as its users. Experienced UA brigades are doing better with worse equipment than the newer NATO-trained ones. At the end of all of that, then, well, you might be feeling a bit depressed, wondering if all the losses that these first 2 months of the counteroffensive have been worth it, if Ukraine really has the ability to scale up break through and march down to Mariupol. Certainly, researching this video, it's been pretty sobering, a much-needed reminder that for all their bravery and tenacity, Kiev's soldiers are not superhumans. However, it isn't quite time to count out Ukraine just yet. It may have stumbled so far, but the counteroffensive is not yet over, and there are signs, little shoots amid the hard frost of disappointment, that Kiev still retains important advantages. Advantages that the AFU may be able to turn into a major win. Now, when NATO countries agreed to train and equip new brigades last year, they weren't talking about just a few thousand Ukrainian troops. They were talking about tens of thousands. Joint Chiefs Chairman General Mark Milley has said that 63,000 AFU soldiers, equivalent to 17 brigades, have undergone NATO training, with more to come. We mention this not just because it's a big number, although it certainly is a big number, but because it's a compelling reason to still consider Ukraine a contender in this fight. Of those Western-trained and equipped brigades, many have still not been committed to the counteroffensive. That means there are tens of thousands of soldiers paired with NATO tanks that are still waiting for the signal to attack. And until we see this force fully committed, it's too early to declare everything a failure. Nor is Ukraine lagging for troops in other sectors. In the east, the BBC recently reported that Kiev's forces had achieved numerical parity with Moscow's for the first time, with each side fielding about 160,000 troops in the region. At the same time, the morale of those fighting for the AFU appears to remain high, and while casualties are also at a high level, the arrival of Western vehicles has at least stopped many of those casualties from becoming fatalities. NATO kit, like the American Bradley, has an advantage in survivability. If you're in one that runs over an anti-tank mine, you're likely to survive with a concussion. In a Soviet design, you don't survive at all. On top of that, the vehicle itself is more likely to be salvageable. That statistic we quoted earlier, about how 20% of all Western vehicles have been lost, well, the true number is likely far lower, as Ukrainian and Polish technicians repair the damage and send them back into battle. That's good news for anyone fighting on Ukraine's side, as it means these vehicles preserve manpower even in the face of the Surovikin Line, a line that may be less sturdy than previously thought. The Institute for the Study of War recently assessed that Russia's defenses might be brittle. Press hard enough in one place, and they just might snap. By this, they don't mean that there are areas where the Surovikin Line is badly constructed. Rather, they mean a lack of troop rotations amid some frontline units might signal exhaustion, an exhaustion that could force a retreat in the event of a breakthrough. This may, at least in part, explain how the counteroffensive has unfolded over July. Along the southern parts of the line, earlier attempts at mechanized advances have given way to an interdiction campaign against Russia's rear areas, as weapons like storm shadows and drones are used to kill officers, destroy ammo dumps, and take out logistics networks. According to ISW, quote, "This campaign is a central aspect of Ukraine's plan to create an asymmetrical attrition gradient that conserves Ukrainian manpower at the cost of a slower rate of territorial gains while gradually wearing down Russian manpower and equipment. Wear them down enough, and the hope is that those brittle lines do finally snap." With Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister recently reporting that the kill ratio in the Berdyansk and Melitopol directions is 5-1 in Ukraine's favor, that snap might actually come sooner than you think. Really though, this all only does apply to the southern theatre. Over in the east, there are two different stories unfolding for Ukraine, one with the potential to be bad, and one with the potential to be perhaps very, very good. The bad one we already covered. In areas along the Kreminna-Svatov line, Russian forces have regained the initiative, are conducting attacks and even making localized gains. But it's at the outskirts of a ruined city that Ukraine might stand its greatest chance of some sort of success. A ruined city that is already synonymous with destruction and grinding slaughter. We're talking, of course, about Bakhmut. The fall of Bakhmut was the one solid victory Russia, backed by Wagner forces, was able to eke out over its winter offensive. Over several months, Ukrainian troops were slowly squeezed out of the city, which turned out to be extremely difficult to defend once the high ground was lost. Well, what was difficult for Ukraine to defend a few months ago is now Russia's challenge, and signs are that Moscow's troops aren't finding it any easier. Because Bakhmut only fell at the end of May, Russia's troops had little time to construct in-depth defenses, like the Surovikin Line. As a result, Ukraine's forces have been making slow but steady progress ever since the counteroffensive began. Late last week, for example, the AFU made what ISW calls tactically significant gains outside the village of Klishchivka, where the Russians were forced to abandon abandon the village of Andrivka. The Ukrainians are pretty open about their goal: to surround the Russian forces in Bakhmut, capture or destroy them, and retake the devastated city. As Colonel Alexander Bakulin told a visiting BBC reporter to quote, "If we put in a bit of effort, Bakhmut could be encircled." Of course, Bakhmut is a ruin, one that in and of itself has only slight strategic value. If the AFU is able to advance beyond it, though, that's where things really get interesting. Permid user: an AFU victory in this battle can open up a path toward the southern region of Bakhmut and to the track that connects the city with the Luhansk region. Although the Luhansk region is of less strategic value than the south, a Ukrainian breakthrough there would still be a devastating psychological blow. Russia has held much of the oblast since 2014. Were that control to be threatened, there's no telling how it might affect morale. We could go on. Maybe analyze the way Ukraine still holds the initiative in multiple sectors. Maybe dwell on how the AFU has achieved far superiority with tube artillery in the south. But time, it is short, and we do need to get this edited and uploaded before the situation at the front changes yet again, so we're going to leave things right there. At the end of all that, then, two things are hopefully clear. One, Ukraine has so far fallen short of Western expectations. That might be because our media hyped the counteroffensive to unhelpful levels, but regardless, we're yet to see any resounding successes. To achieve them, difficult changes need to be made at a tactical level, and it's unclear if the AFU will be able to pull them off. The second thing, though, is that while things are tough, this fight is not yet over. In some key sectors, Kiev retains advantages that could yet translate into victory. Maybe not of the sort that sees Russian forces chased back over the border, but victory nonetheless. Taken together, those two things make for a bittersweet cocktail. And trust us, we'd much rather have spent this entire video boosting Ukraine's successes and telling you that a total collapse of Russian lines was right around the corner. But it's not our job to make you feel good. Instead, we want to give you an honest overview of the situation as real experts have been reporting it, to be truthful about the problems facing Ukraine, even as we try to remain hopeful about the future. Because, as Vladimir Putin has already learned, wars are not won with boosterism or propaganda. For Ukraine to stand a chance at defeating a dug-in enemy, it is vital that citizens of nations back in Kiev understand the reality of what's going on, the challenges and hard choices the AFU are facing, the sacrifices that need to be made. Hopefully, there will be a breakthrough soon. Hopefully, our follow-up video will be nothing but 45 minutes of me doing a bit of a victory dance. Until, or if, that happens though, we need to try and look at these things with clear eyes, to acknowledge the sacrifice tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops are making right now. Only then might we Westerners be prepared to do what we need to do, to press our governments to support Kiev, not just for this one counteroffensive, not even for the next few months, but for the long term. A long term that hopefully will one day soon end in a total Ukrainian victory.